this is new. What's this live stream thing?
I don't know. I just X'd out of it.
Did not like that. I don't like change.
You gonna do it?
Oh, I thought you...
I can do it if you want.
Oh my God. Hi, guys. Welcome back to It's Cool Us Too. I'm Nicole. This is Meg. We're your co-hosts. And
Hi.
yeah, we're being a little weird.
Oh, okay. For two reasons. One, it's a big topic, but also I'm very aware of the fact that this is going to be on YouTube now.
Yeah.
So I want it to look nice. And I want to make sure I look good, look my best.
I kind of just sprung the YouTube on Meg. Last week I was like, oh yeah, by the way, we're on YouTube now. She's like, what?
I mean, I love it. It's awesome.
But we had talked about
it.
I just hadn't told you that episode. But I was like, you know what? If we're going to do it at any point, our 101 and with Kate made sense as like the right episode.
I think so.
To jump in. Let me tell you, learning curve with video editing. Humbling experience, truthfully. If you ended up watching on video, let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you thought about it let us know because it's new for us. So we want to see if you like it. Do you prefer just audio? Should I not waste my time? What's the deal?
I think it was I loved it. It felt so official. Mm-hmm. Like when I checked it out on Spotify and I was like, I can watch myself. I didn't because it felt odd, but yeah, that was pretty cool. So I'm excited about it. We're growing up every day.
We're getting better.
But yeah, we've got a biggie today, as my 3-year-old pal named Bromley would call it. She calls it a biggie when anything's large. But yeah, we've got an episode that we've been kind of like tossing TikToks back and forth about for the last week? Has it been out for a week?
5 few days, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a Diary of a CEO episode with Logan, Yuri, and Scott Galloway where they talk about a generation of lost boys. And truthfully, I think Nicole and I were pretty enraged by the clips that were coming out on TikTok.
Great marketing because it got us to listen and is getting us to talk about it.
Yeah, a lot of the clips were sort of taken out of context, not out of context, but they didn't provide the nuance in the context. Obviously, that's the whole point of clips. But yeah, we want to dive in today, and we're a little nervy about it because this is a big topic, and we want to make sure we do it justice, and also that we're saying what we mean and meaning what we say. Yeah,
we've both listened to the 2-hour and 30-minute episode. And we just spent probably, I'm going to say 45 minutes talking about the episode and our feelings on it and kind of working out some of our gut reactions to some of this. There's still more I'm sure we'll uncover in this episode, but it's hefty. Yeah. And it's something I think both you and I feel very personally to, specifically as it relates to being women in our 30s that are dating.
Men.
Dating men, specifically, yeah. So there's, I think, parts of it that feel a bit more personal to us. Parts that make us very ragey, like you said, and parts that I think maybe for both of us, we feel a little differently on now.
Yeah. Yeah. So in an effort to not lose you, we want you to keep listening.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a little recap of some of the key points. As Nicole said, this was 2 hours and 30 minutes long. There's no way I can run through all of the data that they shared. But I'm going to explain a little bit of kind of what they dove into. And then we're going to talk about just a couple different parts of the episode. I would say, though, it's worth listening to if you have the time. Okay. So what are we dealing with here? So Logan Yuri, she's the director of relationship science at Hinge. She's a behavioral scientist that turned into a dating coach, which is quite interesting. So she works with a ton of young men and women who are trying to meet their quote unquote perfect match. And then Scott Galloway, I think pretty much everyone knows who Scott Galloway is, but his perspective on this specific episode was a lot about masculinity for modern men and boys and sort of what his perspective or opinion is on what some of this data means for young men and I guess women as well in terms of how it's going to impact them if they're in straight relationships or trying to date straight men. So essentially, I guess at the overview, high bird's eye view level, the purpose of why they were doing this was to share information about why something is going on with young men. So they talked about a ton of data about how men are struggling in education, how they're more likely to take their own lives, how there's difficulty in them finding stable work, you know, getting involved in crime. And they also sort of set the stage of like why this matters to you, listener. So the idea of we have the lowest marriage rate in the US we've ever had. The birth rate is going down rapidly. And I think Nicole and I went into this episode thinking, based on the clips, that this was going to be a conversation about how young men are doing poorly and are struggling, and it's young women's fault or women's fault that that's the case. I think they did a reasonably good job. I mean, we definitely have stuff to dive into here of like where we didn't think it worked, but several times they mentioned, particularly Logan Yuri mentioned like, this is not a zero-sum game. Like, we're not trying to say that when men lose, women win or vice versa. So obviously the nuance of the episode came through, and like, at least that context made us feel slightly less ragey about what the
and
point
some empathy.
Exactly. And I'm not going to go through all the data now. We'll probably get into some of it, but like in terms of the stuff they covered, some of the key insights were, you know, young men struggle without a lack of male role models to a greater degree than women might with a lack of male role models. So they didn't ever dive into, you know, how would women react if their mother, for instance, or their female counterpart in a marriage were to not be there or be present. But they did talk a lot about how a male role model is super important for men when they're growing up, and how men do not have as much resilience when it comes to losing that male role model. They talked a lot about how young men are not being set up to be quote unquote remarkable in today's society. So that's like a Scott Galloway term. He talked a lot about how being remarkable is sort of this ethos of the winner takes it all, like the 1%. That's what being remarkable is. A lot of that has to do with being highly educated, super driven, financially literate, and how young men are not being set up for success, which we will dive into. And then at the same time, being remarkable, he talks a lot about, like, he literally uses the phrase, it's all about the Benjamins, but like money and financial, what is the phrase that he used? I'm not remembering right now, but essentially having money is super important, or at least a plan to get money, to form sort of a nest egg. So men really need to be seen as economic contributors, not just for themselves, but for women to sort of be happy, which is something we'll dive into. And then we talked a lot about dating. And I won't go into too much detail there because that's really the part we're going to talk about a lot. Talked a lot about how men don't know how to talk to women. They also don't know how to talk about their feelings in general, and they struggle to communicate. And then finally, they did talk about how young men can help themselves. And this is something we'll talk about, but maybe my perception, in my opinion, it would have been nicer to have a bit more of a focus on sort of actionability around what young men can be doing, or what they should be looking for. What society can be doing. Yeah, exactly.
Like, what do we do about the problem? Because I don't think anyone's disagreeing there's a problem, but it's what do we do about it? Definitely
not. We're agreeing that there is a problem, and it's really sad being confronted with all of those statistics. Like, I listened to this episode at my desk and wrote down, and so I know Cole did too, like literally like taking screenshots of, because it was a video podcast, like taking screenshots of some of the charts. And like, there were so many stats thrown at you, mainly from the UK and the US. And I was like, holy shitballs. Like, this is so scary. So yeah, I don't know, Cole, do you think I missed any important nuance there in terms of what was discussed?
No, I think we're not here to regurgitate the entire episode, or even review the episode. I think we're using it as a jumping off point to have a deeper discussion we all are going to review it because we're going to talk about what, we liked and didn't like and all that stuff. But yeah, I think that covers it. I think the thing that I also wish there was a bit more context around, I know you're saying the data was scary. I wish that the data had more context, because in certain instances, like when they were talking about the gender pay gap reversing and all these things, it was a very specific subset of the population. It wasn't holistically looking at everyone working. It was a very small group. And again, I also just I wish there had been more insight into like where the data came from.
Yeah, that's fair. And I'm sure it was pulled from lots of different places. And a lot
Yeah.
of it was also anecdotal, like particularly the stuff Logan was talking about.
Or from like her survey.
Yes, from her survey, or like conversations she's had with young people. So what did you like about the episode?
I liked that there was more than just like one person being interviewed. I did like the dynamic between the three of them. And I really appreciated how, again, coming out of it, and we'll talk more about this in a second, because of how long the episode was, it was so much more nuanced than I anticipated going in. And I left with more empathy for men I maybe have ever had before.
Yeah.
In some ways. And it's caused me to self-reflect in some areas. And one of the parts that I really liked, which we'll talk about, what annoyed me is they didn't spend enough time on it. So I really liked when they were talking about what advice does, Scott, who coaches young men, what advice does he have to men to like address the issue and do all these things. But it was such a small fraction of the episode overall that frustrated me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think the exploration of where young men are right now, and we keep talking about how the stats are scary. Like, I feel like I should give a little bit of context as to what we mean by those. Like, essentially stats around suicide rates in young men, stats around like loneliness and how loneliness is getting so much worse. And then there were some more anecdotal things, like Scott Galloway got really choked up at the end where he was saying, he hears from hundreds of young men on a weekly basis, and he doesn't even know what to say to them anymore. Like, these people reaching out to him saying like, and when we say young men, I think he's referring to like 20s and 30s. Like, there are like some teens in there, but typically it's like people in their 20s and stuff, like just feeling listless, feeling like they don't have a purpose. They don't know how to get out of this like hole that they're in. So yeah, that was the part of it that was quite scary. Around porn consumption was also terrifying. Did you know 30% of all web traffic is porn related? And men make up 80% of that. Yeah, anyways. So yes, okay, so you like that you were able to have more empathy for men.
Yeah, I think that there was definitely parts about it that I hadn't really considered before. Which, again, the whole point of listening to content and listening to different people is to open our way of thinking and being more open to changing perspectives and different experiences more than anything. And I feel like to that end, I did get something out of it from this podcast.
Yeah.
Still parts that made me very ragey though. What about you?
I mean, I think I feel similarly. I think the part I appreciated the most, or like understood the most, or felt the most empathy towards, was just the lack of like shared communities for young men. So, talking about how Boy Scouts doesn't exist anymore, and like, and who knows if that was like the right forum. Like, I don't know anything about Boy Scouts, but just like, where do men go to find community? How do they develop relationships with other young men that are positive? I thought that was, I didn't have an answer for it, but I definitely felt it. And I think women, in my experience, are a lot better at forging really strong bonds as they're growing up and being more vulnerable with their friends. And so I definitely felt for men. I also have a younger brother. He's early 30s and has his own struggles, and definitely has struggled to find a community. So I felt a lot of empathy towards some of the stuff that was speaking to men in that age range who are just trying to figure out kind of how to set themselves up and be happy.
Yeah.
But in terms of things that annoyed me, there were several. We keep using the word ragey, but I think that like, I kind of said it already, but there wasn't a lot of focus on like, well, what I said was there wasn't a lot of focus on how young men can start to feel better, or how young men can start to create a better world for themselves to live in and feel better about themselves. I think where I struggled a lot was it didn't feel like there was a ton of accountability on male role models for young men. And like what those people should be doing to help. I think Scott Galloway kind of glazed over this idea of men sometimes not feeling comfortable stepping up to be role models for young men that are not their kids. or their kid, but what can those people be doing? Like, I'm not suggesting it only has to be men, but a lot of what Scott Galloway was saying is that it's way more effective when it is men, when the role model is a man. So if that's the case, how can men who are, say, 15, 20, 30 years older than these young men that are struggling, how can they be doing something to enact some sort of change? That's one thing that I would have loved to hear more about.
Or even more conversation around societal structural changes that need to be adjusted with this new world in mind. Like, we're more technically advanced. We do have, changing statistics in terms of underrepresented groups, or, people who historically in society maybe haven't been prioritized are succeeding in different areas now. So how do we kind of balance our societal structures? How are we addressing education, which typically has not changed or been adjusted for the world we live in today? Haven't looked at even how the cost of living and the way our economies are set up right now also impact the decisions that we make, both men and women, when it comes to choosing a partner or decisions in terms of how we live our lives. We've talked at length about single tax. I think both of us would love a partner from the financial side of things. Again, not necessarily looking at someone who makes more money than us, but just someone who we can split things with, even.
Yeah.
And how much easier it would be for us financially to get ahead if we had a partner. Like, there's so many different topics we can get into, and it relates to here. And I just wish that there was more conversations around how does society need to change, and what structures need to change or institutions need to change to better enable collective success, or address some of the major challenges that everyone's facing right now. It just so seems that this specific subset of the population is not responding well to it as, say, maybe other groups are.
Yeah. Yeah, like, I think I went into this podcast thinking it was the crux of it was going to be like, but what about men?
Yeah.
Like, that's sort of the vibe. And that's why I was like preparing myself to be annoyed. And I would say that, like, it was still a conversation that was like, what about men? And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a conversation about that. So I'm not trying to say, like, why wasn't this conversation about women? But as someone who's single in their mid to late 30s, as someone who would love to meet someone, it's very hard for me to remove the lens of why is it being framed? Yeah, of my experience. Why is this problem being framed in the way that it is? Like, I think that it's very hard for me to take that out. I mean, we were talking about there's two sides to this. I have 2 points kind of I wanted to make around this. Like, one is, if this was a podcast that was about the state of young women and their loneliness and how they're feeling lost and disenfranchised, in my opinion, I think that it would have focused a lot more on what they could be doing to better themselves and to, quote unquote, catch up with their male counterparts. That's my opinion. I was surprised by the ratio of exploration versus like actionability or what people could do. So there's that of like, I can't take away the fact that like I'm a woman and I look at things in that perspective. But even just things about like the way that the episode was framed, this idea of like the lost boys and what are we going to do to support our men? I think there could have been an aspect of the conversation that was around like, how are we going to solve this at a societal level, as opposed to it being so specific to the male experience.
And I think we just talked about this before we got on. The reality is why I think it was framed that way is the catastrophic result of having this many disenfranchised and lonely and, isolated young men, and what they have the potential to turn into relative to if you had this massive subset of the population that were women that were lonely and reserved and pulled back, what they would turn into. Right? Like, the conversation did transition around incels and violence and addiction and crime and all of that. And I think we can't remove that from the conversation here because it's a reality of the situation that we're in.
Yeah. I
The
thought there were, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to totally transition away. So if
Okay.
your
I was
point
just going to say the things that really annoyed me, and I listened to half the episode driving and half the episode in front of my thing. And there were two instances early on in the episode that Scott Galloway said that really bothered me. And the first one was as it related to education of young children. And he made a comment about how education and the way that our school system is set up does not favor young boys. And he said, what do we want out of young, good students? We want them to sit there, raise their hand, please people, like, just be good students. That's a girl. And I was so enraged by the just immediate line of those characteristics solely being feminine and not necessarily being the basis of what would we just expect from a decent person, child included. And how like that just like I nearly pulled my car off the road to type notes into my notes app.
Yeah.
The other thing that really frustrated me specifically about the app, because I think not the app, the episode, because I want us to get specific on some of these things because I think we could stay high level in all of it for so long. There was a conversation around divorce and how the court system typically favors women, like the mother over the father. And there was a conversation or a comment made by Scott about how, and I can't remember, so again, go listen for yourself. But there was a comment made about how, like, a single father of someone he knew, or a man he knew who's a single father of two, I think, young girls, like 13 and 15, he got them like every other weekend. And he was frustrated because when he would finally get access to his kids, the kids wanted nothing to do with them because they have their own lives and they're doing all the other things. And my initial reaction was, it's not the responsibility of the child to, and I say this as someone who comes from a divorced family, it shouldn't be the responsibility of the child to make sure that the parent is okay. That is not something that
I think
should
that's
be
true. I agree with that.
Yeah. And so, and if specifically, if it was a father with two daughters and there are things that maybe you don't feel like you can connect with your kid, maybe try to figure out what they're into. Like I had parents that did 50-50 in terms of custody. So I was 1 week on, 1 week off with each of them. And we ended up going eventually to 2 weeks and 2 weeks because it was just too much disruption to move my life back and forth every week. And I had, parents that equal parts put me in things like soccer and skiing and golf, but also showed up to things like my cheerleading competitions, which is, again, more on the feminine side, or would support some of my more creative endeavors that I was really into, again, inherently feminine. And I had a dad specifically who would show up to those things, even though it wasn't in his normal wheelhouse. And so my frustration with the comment around divorce and all of that comes down to, I don't know how many fathers are truly willing to meet their kids where they are and are just basically giving up when their kids aren't interested in the things that they want them to be into. And when you have a parent that is solely there, every other weekend, you do get the highlight reel and you don't get kind of the admin and the key details of raising a child. Like, and I brought up a TikTok I saw recently on TikTok that this man was talking about how he was kind of blindsided by the divorce and how in the custody hearing, his wife basically used the fact that he didn't know the name of his child's teacher, the name of the child's pediatrician, or like the name of the child's best friend as evidence as to why he wasn't capable of being there the majority of the time because he wasn't truly present in the kid's life. He was just basically there for the highlight reel. And so I think there needs to be, with that comment that really drove me nuts, we need to relook at, especially with the change of gender norms where, it used to be the mother would stay home and be a stay-at-home mom and the father would be the provider. And so it was a bit clearer in terms of like what your responsibilities were. In today's economy, it's very difficult to have a single income household. So the likelihood that both parents are working and financially contributing to the household is high. And the likelihood, I'm going to generalize here, and I understand that there are exceptions to every rule, but women are still primarily being the ones rearing the children, whether that's, prepping their lunches, taking them to doctor's appointments, putting them to bed, nursing them while they're sick, all of these things, in addition to also still maintaining a job. And I think that we need to look at how do we rebalance the responsibilities and mental load as it relates to parenting to equate for where we are today in society and what our economy has been set up for.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went on a bit of a soapbox there.
No, that was great. I mean, I wasn't clear. I have a lot of other things to say about the things that annoy me. I just wasn't going to piggyback on what you had said before. But yeah. I think you've articulated that so well. I think, and especially because it is like a very real experience that you've been through too, right? Yeah. I know that your parents are amazing, but like you did have to sort of manage the fact that like you were being brought into two different households at every month. So I think there's a couple things, and I know we want to talk about the specifics around dating after this, but there was a couple things I did want to just like pick apart a little bit. I thought this is a little more trivial, but there were just a couple of things that like I was like, wow, this is such an inherently like trivial perspective that feels very hetero masculine. Okay. So Scott and Steven Bartlett, the host, were talking about how, what is it that women want? And so then they asked Steven Bartlett asked Logan, what are men looking for? And Scott had mentioned so many things that young men needed to get better at or needed to focus on. And Steven Bartlett chose to say, Scott mentioned height. And it's like, oh, for God's sakes. Like, there are so many other things. Like, I understand this trope of like, so many women want men who are 6 feet tall.
6'5", blue eyes,
6'5", blue eyes. Yeah. But I'm like, and then of course they go on to say, and we know that only 14% of men in the US are 6 feet or taller. It's like, okay, I don't know. I'm not really with you on this one. Like,
can I say, as a 5'9", quote unquote, tall girl, while I am definitely attracted to men that are taller, for the record, I have also been attracted to men that are shorter than me. So totally. Please stop making this argument as to like why, like something that men can't change, obviously, that women need to get over. Because I guarantee you, not as many women are hung up on that truly at the end of the day when it comes to a relationship.
I mean, in my experience of that being rolled out as like, I want a tall man, it's because we're talking about all the things we actually want, like emotional availability, to feel safe, to feel like you're in their corner, someone who's funny. And then, okay, yeah, throw in, their 6'5" blue eyes, which is sort of a joke. So maybe that's just my experience, but I just thought that there were certain things where they were trivializing what single women were looking for. I think there was a little bit of that in the conversation around porn. Scott Galloway was talking about how we're taking young men's mojo away with frictionless, open access, on-demand corn. Sorry, I should probably be saying corn. And like I wrote in my notes, like, doesn't this relate to women too? It felt very reminiscent of this argument that men are hardwired to be more sexual. Like this trope around men are the sexual ones and they just need to get off and like think that that's been debunked. I'm not suggesting that men don't spend a ton of time on porn, and I do not have the data corn, and I do not have the data to hand to speak to how it compares across men and women. But I just think it felt very old world, like old school. Here's how men think about sex.
Yeah, where I think there is a difference between men and women. I don't think men are inherently more or less sexual than women. I think it's pretty on par. I think that where women seek inspiration, we'll call it.
I love that.
Is probably not in the same mediums as men, right? And one of the challenges around porn is oftentimes the depiction of violence against women in those instances, maybe really like twisted dynamics in those things as well. I'm not talking about kinks. And I think, the engagement between men and women in those depictions of intimacy. on the flip side, where a lot of women are typically getting, and this is based on how we're wired, men are visual, women, and Scott even says this in the episode, he's like, men are visual, women are like, listen. It's very different. A lot of women are listening to audio options, or they're reading about intimacy and sex in a different medium that is probably less controversial and less risky in terms of the societal impact of consuming that content.
Yeah.
Right? Like I joked to you yesterday and to my sister the other day. I was like, you can kind of tell how my life's going by two key indicators. One is the state of my apartment, and two is like, how many spicy books have I read? And I'm like, I've read 4 in the last week. So like, and I would consider myself to be a sexual person. I'm not necessarily out engaging with multiple people, but I feel very in touch with that side of myself, but I'm not consuming, like I'm not on Pornhub. Anyways, you know what I mean? Like that's not where I'm getting my rocks off, basically. And I think that we have to identify the fact that where and the type of, like where they're getting it and the type of content and how it's actually regulated is probably a bigger conversation for us to have.
Totally. And they did not dive into any of that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there is a lot of complexity around it.
Yeah.
And nuance. How many times can I say nuance in one episode? But yeah, there was just something about that ground my gears. I was like, oh, I don't love it.
Yeah. And I think that there is a healthy dose of, at least from the point of Scott Galloway in the episode, that I felt was like yearning for yesteryear and like the good things of the past. And I'll use a specific example where he wished that Gen Z was going out more and drinking and going to bars and meeting people, because, you know, alcohol is a social lubricant and all of these things. And it brings around people in, you know, different spaces. And Gen Z are typically, they're more than any other generation that in history are exploring sober curiosity. You know, they don't want to drink. They don't want to deal with anxiety. They don't want to have a hangover. They're looking at the health implications of alcohol as well.
Yeah.
And he's like, I wish more people were drinking. And I was like, I think what we're skirting around here is we just need to find more pockets for communities and ways to socialize. And especially post-pandemic, the world is not set up to do that. So in Toronto, there's a wonderful example. There's like a coffee party that's happening. It takes more effort to set up, but like it's not centered around alcohol, and alcohol doesn't have to be the main focal point in a lot of this. And that's a very specific example from within the episode. But I think we all collectively have to agree, regardless of what side of the coin you're on, that the days of yesteryear are gone, and the reality we're all living in today is different. It's been irrevocably changed, I can't speak today, from the pandemic, from technology, from changing societal structures, and the things that maybe previous generations really relied on to build connection and find their mate maybe just don't work in the society that we have built today.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I want to dive into like one of the core points that Scott Galloway was making. Like one of the big things he said in a variety of different ways throughout the episode was that male desirability is tied specifically to economic viability. So said another way, a man is more desirable if they're economically viable. Does that rhyme? Wild. So he literally says at one point, he did preface this by saying you can't tell women to lower their expectations. So
yes, no, he was very even with that. Yeah.
Yes. He said, but you could ask a man if they'd want to date a woman who has 80% of what they want in a woman, and 75% would say yes. But if you asked a woman if they'd want to date a man who has 80% of what they want, 75% say no. That was one of the quotes. And he said it in a variety of sort of different ways. And to be clear, I think that those were I just want to make it clear that like, I don't know that he was pulling the data from somewhere. I think he was just speaking from experience. Like that's what he thinks is true. And I think Cole and I felt that was not true.
I think you have to, like, who are these men that they're asking, first of all? Like, what are their characteristics, first and foremost? Like, and then who are the women you're asking? Are you asking women who are earning, you know, high 6 figures or, you know, or mid 6? Like, who are these women? And who are these men? I just don't think that was properly addressed within this, because I don't think you can use this as an entire sample size across a generation.
Yeah.
So start there. But my first question is, well, what is the 80% and what's the 20%?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Like, are we talking like, okay, like if I took all the things that I'm looking for in a potential partner, there are certain things that are way more important than other things.
Like, is that 20% he's loyal, has integrity, and treats people with kindness? Or is it, I make more money than him, he's not as tall as I would like, he, you know, maybe doesn't have, I don't know what those characteristics are, but quantifying what the 80% is versus the 20 is super important. There are so many instances in my dating history or men I've been attracted to or engaged with that they have not met 100% of my list. And I've perpetually been told by people who don't see how I'm dating, I need to be less picky. I am less picky. My list of what I'm looking for is like, I'm open to so many different things. I'm willing to compromise on a number of issues, but I'm sorry, integrity, loyalty, kindness, and having a job is not one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I kind of buried the lead here, like around economic viability, and the second thing around, women are too picky is sort of the vibe of what I was getting from what Scott Galloway was saying in that instance, in my opinion. And I think the reason that the two were connected in his argument is this idea of women care so much more about economic viability than they feel comfortable admitting. Almost like that's sort of the subtext of what it was saying. So the 20% that we're not willing to give up, Scott Galloway, and this is just how I was interpreting what he was saying. It felt like he was talking about money. It felt like he was talking about, do they have a good job? And that's what we're not willing to give up, even though we say we want emotional intelligence. Like, if that 20% isn't there, then the man doesn't stand a chance. And I do not agree with that. And I say this from such a place of privilege, and Nicole could say it as well. I make my own money. Like, it felt at odds with the rest of the argument. Like, sure, single tax is real, but I'm not looking for someone to, unless I'm having
bankroll me.
I'm not looking for someone to bankroll me. Exactly. Thank you.
I think the conversation has to go back to, again, what's the 80, what's the 20? Because I refuse to get into a relationship with someone who is going to, I've been heartbroken, I've been fucked around, I've been cheated on, I've been lied to, I've been distraught over my relations with men. And that 20%, if they are core values of that human, no, I'm not willing to date someone that's going to make my life worse off.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. And I think being in conversations with, there's more and more single people as they get older, because it's harder to meet people these days. Yeah. It just is. And I think in those conversations, I think it's just funny because it felt like almost antithetical what he was saying to the data that they were presenting of, like, women are more economically viable than they ever have been. Like, they are smart, they are in positions of power, but yet they want their male counterpart or their male partner to be the breadwinner. And in those conversations I'm having with other single women who are my age, and that we're having on this podcast, even, like, what we're talking about are the things that we saw in that Benny Blanco interview that everyone's sharing on TikTok of like why Benny Blanco is so amazing and why that's sort of what we're looking for. And I think it doesn't ring true to me, the argument.
Yeah, because arguably if you like I looked at the Benny, I'll fully admit and raise my hand, I looked at that relationship, I was like, what is she doing? Like, and again, that's my bias to bear and reflect on. But watching that episode, I pray that sort of love runs me over. The way that man held space for her, understood what she needed and how to show up for her, was so kind and loving and supportive of her. That at the end of the day, and just, it's worth so much. I guarantee you, in so many relationships, why women end up leaving is they've told their partner so many times over, I need this from you. This would make me feel really great if you did X, Y, and Z. And again, I guarantee you it's something like, if you're going to be out late, text me. If you are traveling and, whatever, send me like a good morning and a good night text or something, just to whatever. It can be super simple. And so many men that I see are like blindsided by the fact that the relationship ends when they've been told so many times over, how can you show up for me as a partner? Because I guarantee you most women are telling their partners, and men too in some instances as well. I don't want to overgeneralize here. But to be a strong partner in today's day and age, you have to be able to articulate what you need out of your relationship. And watching Benny Blanco and Selena Gomez, I was just like, this is what I want. Like, this is a physical manifestation of what I want in a partner. And I guarantee you, to Scott Galloway's point about women wanting men who are economically viable, there are absolutely women within society, because I don't want to, who will prioritize money over everything. And that is what is important to them.
Good point.
Like, and there's going to be women that are going to be able, I'm going to put up with, I don't care if he cheats, I don't care if he does this, that, or whatever. He makes a lot of money. It's like, what's that line from White Lotus right now? It's like, why are you with this middle-aged weirdo? Does he have a lot of money? And it's like, maybe for some people, that's what they care about. But to generalize that women, the only thing we want is money, is so infuriating and so reductive. It drives me nuts.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that. And I think we just nailed that point, man. I have one more thing I need to get home about on this, because what I do think is not covered in this is something Tinks talks about so often, and why I think that what Scott Galloway was talking about isn't correct in this instance. Men typically date on what's in front of them, and women date on potential. So I guarantee, and I can speak from my experience as well, I look at a guy, and again, and they kind of touch on this later in the episode, where they're like, okay, you may not have a great job right now, but do you have a plan? Do you have ambition? What are the key core values that you have that indicate you might be successful down the line, or you might be a really strong partner in other ways down the line? And I just don't think that we're giving women enough credit on seeing past what's directly in front of them today. Yeah. So I think that we've really made the point there in terms of, I don't necessarily agree, and I don't think Cole agrees with the assessment that women's number one, like, male desirability is so closely tied to their economic status. Or basically, I don't know that it's all about the Benjamins. I do think that I learned a lot about, I thought Scott Galloway was really crass in moments that I kind of appreciated, in the sense that, like, I felt I understood a bit more maybe what men might be thinking in any given situation, or straight men might be thinking in any given situation. Like, he talked about his wife, and he was like, when he met his wife, he's like, I saw her and I looked at her and I was like, I want to have sex with that woman. And I figured out a way to go and talk to her. And he was like, I know that that's really crass, but like, that was initially my thought. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. And obviously I fell in love with her, and I put the effort in to go and speak to her and a few of her friends. And in that context, he was talking about the fact that men need to be more willing to kind of go after what they're looking for and be proactive. But I do think that while there were a lot of times where I disagreed with what he was saying, I think I did feel more empathetic and like more connected maybe to the experience of being a straight guy, and trying to, I guess, manage the emotions and like the mental load of all of that.
I think too, like, it's hard as a woman dating on the apps, and I think it made me realize that it's equally as difficult for men. And it made me a bit more empathetic to how challenging it might be for them as well. Because I think you and I have talked about this so like ad nauseum on this podcast about dating and our experience with it, and ghosting and texting, and how utterly burnt out we are when it comes to dating, and how hard it is to, quote unquote, get it up for it in a lot of ways. And I really had never taken, this is really bad on me, but I'd never taken a moment to appreciate maybe what it's like from the other side. And I have maybe used some of my bad experiences to paint all men with those same brushes, which isn't great as well.
Yeah.
And so I think they did a really good job in this episode of outlining, well, here's where we got to where we are now, this is what the reality is like for a lot of these guys. So as someone who's actively engaged in dating straight men right now, I do think it'll change my approach and maybe give guys a little bit more grace, especially early on, that first interaction on the app, the meeting men in the wild, things like that. I think I've done the opposite of giving them more grace longer term versus right up front.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I think like giving them grace at the beginning, because a lot of what they talked about on the episode is like, there were two things. One is like, it's really hard for men to approach women post Me Too movement. I mean, there were certain things about that I didn't agree with, but I also can understand the anxiety of approaching a girl and knowing what to say and how to do it. I think Logan, from the relationship science director from Hinge, she was saying that there was someone she'd spoken to. It was a woman who'd created an AI agent to essentially help teenagers or young people figure out how to date better. And the top question that was being asked was, how do I ask someone out in real life? Like, how do I do that? And so that's so very sweet. I think these were like 16 to 20-year-olds, like young generation, but like, it's very sweet. It's something that people struggle to do. I'm sure
totally
men our age are also trying to figure that out. So while yes, it would be wonderful to be approached, I think you also mentioned, I can't remember if it was on the recording or before, but women do need to get better at signaling to men that they're open to that, you know? And
I see a hot guy and I like go eyes down. Like
totally.
And I say hot guy, but a guy I'm attracted to out in the wild, because when you're out in the wild, I don't know anything about you besides what I'm seeing in front of me. So I am making it about the physical appearance at that point, but I don't do a very good job of signaling to a guy that I'm interested and open for him to approach me. And I think if we want to still maintain traditional, in some ways, gender roles and have men be the one approaching women, women also have to, quote unquote, drop the handkerchief better.
Yes, love that. And then to your point too of giving them more grace at the beginning. A lot of Logan again said, you know, with her husband, who she loves and is amazing, like she's not sure if she would have given him a second date if they hadn't met in a very specific set of circumstances. So I think, you know, they also talked a lot about how men struggle with communication. They don't know how to be vulnerable. And I think I sometimes am expecting men to open up in the way I open up on a first date. And I'm like, I should never do that, because truthfully, I'm the most open person ever. So that's not realistic. And I think I need to check myself a little bit of like, what am I really trying to understand about that potential person, or that person, not potential person.
Totally.
But potential partner on the first and second date. And I think Logan even said, like, I would always recommend you go on two. Like, as long as it's not a hell no, go on another date.
Yeah, I will say I pride myself on this. I am usually if I go out on a date with a guy and I'm like, yeah, there's absolutely zero way I will ever see this man again, or like there's literally nothing for me to build off of. Yeah, no, I'm not going to go out again. But I have on many occasions, the first date, I'm like, I'm not really sure. I don't immediately go, I'm not going to see him again. I've gone on like 2, 3, 4 dates with a guy, trying to go there, trying to open up, trying to connect, and truthfully give something a chance to see if there's legs to it, right?
Yeah.
If there's a connection here between us. And I have been on the other side of that, where a guy's gone out with me a few times and then told me, listen, I'm just not interested. I don't feel what I should be feeling at this point.
Yeah.
And I think when it relates to dating, you can't fault someone if they're just not into it, assuming they've given it a true shot. Where I fault people is once you've gone on a few dates with someone, ghosting, right? One of the guys I went out with last summer, I will say nothing but good things about him, simply for the fact that when he was not interested, mind you, I had spent like 24 hours agonizing over the pullback basically at Megan's cottage. But after 20, like this man full on was like, called me, didn't just text me, called me and told me how he was feeling and said, listen, I just don't see where this is going. And, you know, this isn't really what I'm looking for and not the connection I'm looking for. I was so much respect for that. And I think collectively we have to be better at just being more open and giving something a fair shot, but then also communicating when it's not it for us, because you're going to have a whole hell of a lot less jaded people if we all just treat each other with a bit more respect and are honest and upfront about how we're feeling throughout dating.
Yeah. Well, very well said, Cole.
Thanks. Sometimes I have moments.
Okay, I think we should wrap up. I think we've covered most of what we wanted to cover. We could probably do
like 3 episodes
on this, but we wanted to keep it super relevant to the content that you guys love. But before we do wrap up, it's so funny because we were like, why didn't they talk more about things that men could be doing on their episode? And that's sort of what we're going to close with in the last few minutes.
Yeah.
But I did just want to explain to people kind of high level what some of Scott Galloway, Steven Bartlett, and Logan Urie's advice was for young men to get themselves out of that lost and lonely place. So there's like so much here. So I'll start, and Cole, you add. Scott Galloway's was like essentially figure out how to make money, figure out a path to making money. And he didn't mean being in the 1%. He just meant figure out how to support yourself, figure out what that looks like so that you can be economically viable. Get strong, go to the gym, feel good in your body, put yourself in the company of strangers. So he mentioned, like, I ask my 2 sons to talk to a stranger once a day before they come home.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of interesting. So being comfortable doing that. Seek no. So put yourself in situations where you're asking to hang out with someone. It could be potential romantic connection. It could be just friends. And it's okay if they say no, or they're not available, or they're not interested, which I thought was great. Logan Urie talked a lot about getting passionate about something and learning how to communicate about that passion, and that being really interesting, particularly with romantic partners. She also talked about how, like, all you have to do is show effort. So, like,
yes.
I mean, little simple things, but like remembering your, the date's best friend's name, planning something thoughtful, texting them. Yeah. Those are some of the main things. I mean, they talked about a couple of other things like male manners being really important and figuring out how to make a woman feel safe. And Logan also said something that I loved about reading fiction. She specifically suggested that young straight men read fiction because it allows you to empathize with female perspectives and other male perspectives. But I thought that was really great because I don't know the last time I spoke to a straight man who was reading fiction.
Yeah, and specifically I would say fiction written by women.
Totally.
Right? Like, it's a really easy way to understand in some instances how the female brain works and what we value. And I got a list of very easy to digest. They're not the highest of brow books, but hey. Tomato. I think the thing that really resonates with me, and I feel it so strongly, I would rather date a man who a job but maybe wasn't nearly as successful as me, but he had something he cared about and was passionate about. That he just felt so strongly. So whether that was, health and fitness, or it was something like this, like a podcast that you and I have, or maybe it's, he really shows up for maybe he has a niece or a nephew that he really shows up for and he's so passionate about being a strong role model for that kid. That sort of passion and dedication and application of oneself is so attractive to me, more so than how successful you are. I don't care what your title is. And I wish more men understood that. And at the end of the day, what we've talked about so often on this podcast is women will show up. We're wired in a way, especially once you maybe get past the first hurdle, where I think dating is so hard for men. It's that the first interaction and then maybe the first date or so, but it gets harder for women into longer term relationships. At least that's been my experience. And what I'm looking for longer term is someone who's just willing to keep showing up and putting in the effort. Because if I love you, I will be there and I will show up. And that I demonstrate that every day, even as a single woman, as it relates to my family and my female friendships. So I think that is just, I wish more men understood at the end of the day. We just need you to show up and, listen to what we tell you and we tell you what we need.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are you taking from this, or what advice would you have for our listeners after listening to this episode of how they might, go out into the world and leave it a little better?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to be like, men are just humans too. And I mean, they are, but like to assume that you're coming at a situation in the same way that maybe a man that you're dating is coming at a situation, and that you guys have the same level of quote unquote experience in life. I think it made me feel a lot more empathy for what the experience of being a man is to a degree. I think I'm not walking away from this episode being like, wow, it is so much harder to be a man than I thought, but I also feel like more connected to what that experience might be. So I think that that's really great. And I think at the end of the day, that's a good step forward for women, is to feel a bit more connected to what that experience is. I hope the same is happening from the male perspective. And I think I think one thing I'm walking away from this conversation with is women are fucking great. Like we we are in a situation right now where you talked about the previous gender roles in a marriage, the male as the financial provider, women as a homemaker.
Yeah.
Women have figured out how to do
Both.
Everything. We figured out how to have the role of the financial provider, how to take care of themselves, how to take care of their homes. I think we're in a very, very new territory. And I'm just like really proud to be a woman, which I know is cringy,
Totally.
but I think it's pretty epic.
Totally. I think I'm going to bring it back to one thing Scott Galloway said, and it's something that I believe as well, which is you can have everything, but maybe not all at once. And I think that you're totally right. A lot, like, we have such a huge subset of the population that are single, successful, high achieving women. But I think if you were to ask any of us, do we want to do it all alone? No. I think that there's definitely,
Yeah.
like, I have always believed that you can do anything you want in this world. And I think that in the way we were growing up, where it was, girl power and all these things, we were told we could do anything. You just simply can't do everything. So the unfortunate realities of our situation is, and they kind of touch on it, I'm ending on such a downer, but I'll come back to it in a second, is like, while we are, high achieving women right now, we don't have kids. So we're not being pulled in that direction right now. And I think that if I was to give any reassurance to a single man listening, I think that most women are keen for partnership, but partnership is the key word here.
Yeah.
And I don't think inherently we're repelled by the idea of men.
No.
Just like, F it, let's do it on my own. I'm a single, strong, independent woman. Like, none of us want that. We do want companionship. We want a romantic relationship, and we want a partnership, but not at a cost that we're not willing to bear.
Said very well.
The two things that I'll kind of beyond that take away from this episode for myself are the recommendations I would have to other people is kind of like you said, have more grace and just be more aware of how you're showing up in public spaces. Like, are you making yourself open and free? And I'm excited for an episode we're going to do in a few weeks around feminine energy. Like, how are you kind of presenting yourself as a woman in society to make it easier for a guy to feel safe to also come up to you? Mm-hmm. And the other thing would be, like, our society isn't there's a lot of things wrong today, like that are kind of the foundational problems that we're looking at that have caused so many of these issues. So whether that is our education system, cost of living, your ability to buy and own a home, all of these things, we all, assuming you're over 18, are able to vote. We live in a democratic society. So I would encourage anyone listening to actively dive into politics a little bit more than maybe you have previously. Understand how our society works, like what's a provincial matter, we're in Canada, versus a federal matter versus a municipal matter. And just inform yourself when you're voting or when you're taking a more active role engaging with your candidates. Like, we're in a federal election here in Canada, and like, again, I don't know everything, but I pride myself on being pretty well informed on certain things that I like versus don't like from different candidates. And I would say if we're looking at key societal structures, exercising that democratic vote is super important.
Thanks, Coley.
Thanks, Maggie.
We'll talk to you guys soon, okay? Let us know what you thought of this one. It was a doozy, but we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.